Lucas Marshall never imagined his world would change like this. Sitting in the dimly lit office of his family's lawyer, his heart pounded as if it were about to break free from his chest. The thick silence of the room only made it worse, and the weight of the words he had just heard sank deep into his bones. "Your grandfather left you the mansion. But there's a condition," the lawyer had said, his voice calm, oblivious to the storm brewing inside Lucas. Lucas clenched his jaw, his gaze locked on the stack of papers in front of him. The inheritance wasn't the problem. He had expected to get something from the vast Marshall estate, a company, some shares, a property. But this? A decrepit old mansion in a town he didn't even remember visiting as a child? And the condition? That was the cruelest part. He had to live there for a year. Not alone. With someone named Clara Evans, a name that meant nothing to him. The betrayal hit him like a punch to the gut. His grandfather, the man he had idolized, the titan of their empire, had written a stranger into his will, a complete unknown. Lucas felt a knot forming in his throat. Who was Clara Evans? And why did she matter so much to his grandfather? The betrayal quickly turned to rage. How could his family, his own blood, let him face this humiliation? A woman he didn't know, now tied to him for a year? The Marshall legacy, with all its responsibilities and privileges, had never felt so suffocating. His world had been about control, about shaping the family's empire, and now it felt like that control was slipping through his fingers. As the days passed, the tension inside him only grew. Each unanswered question gnawed at his sanity. His family had avoided the topic, brushing it aside like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Not to him. What was his grandfather hiding? What had been so important about this mansion, and more importantly, about this woman, that it demanded a whole year of his life? 2 weeks later, Lucas found himself standing before the very mansion that now chained him to Clara Evans. The once majestic house had long fallen into disrepair. Ivy crawled over the faded stone walls, and broken windows stared out like hollow eyes. This wasn't the polished wealth he was used to. No, this place was a skeleton of its former glory, and now it was his burden to bear. From the moment he stepped out of his car, the air around the mansion felt heavy, oppressive even. Lucas squared his shoulders, refusing to let the unease show. He was a Marshall. He didn't falter. But the nerves gnawing at the back of his mind whispered otherwise. What kind of twisted game had his grandfather set in motion? As Lucas approached the mansion's creaky front door, there she was, Clara Evans. She stood tall, arms crossed, leaning against the stone pillar as if waiting for a fight. Her eyes met his, sharp, assessing, and completely unfazed by his presence. She wasn't what he had expected. She wasn't intimidated by the Marshall name, not the way most people were. There was no awe, no deference in her posture. She didn't greet him. She didn't smile. If anything, she looked at him like he was the outsider. For a moment, Lucas couldn't move. He felt an unfamiliar sensation crawling under his skin. Was it fear? No. Frustration. Rage. Clara Evans, I presume, he finally managed, his voice cool, masking the storm brewing inside him. She nodded, not bothering with pleasantries. And you must be the golden boy, she shot back, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I'm guessing you didn't come here by choice. Lucas bristled. The arrogance in her tone, the lack of respect, it grated on him. This isn't a situation I would have chosen, he said through gritted teeth, stepping closer. But I'll do what's necessary to fulfill my grandfather's wishes. Clara raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Funny, coming from someone who's never worked a day outside his shiny corporate bubble. Lucas narrowed his eyes. She knew nothing about him. You don't know me, he said coldly, and you certainly don't know what I've worked for. Clara shrugged, pushing off the pillar and turning toward the door. I know enough, but this mansion? It's not a corporate office, and I doubt you're ready for what it's going to take to rebuild this place. Lucas felt the blood rushing to his head. Rebuild? He hadn't signed up for this. The place looked like it hadn't seen repairs in decades. "We aren't here to talk about the house," he said, trying to regain control of the situation. "I want to know why my grandfather put us both here. What's your connection to him?" Clara's eyes darkened, her expression hardening. For the first time, Lucas saw something flicker across her face, something more than defiance. Pain? Anger? It vanished too quickly to be sure. "That's something you'll have to figure out for yourself," she said, her tone flat, before pushing the door open and walking inside without another word. Lucas stood there for a moment, fists clenched at his sides. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had imagined a quick, cold interaction, a way to set the boundaries and assert control over the situation. But Clara wasn't going to make it easy. She was a mystery, and the more she evaded his questions, the more he realized there was something much deeper at play. Inside the mansion, the air was thick with dust and disuse. The grand foyer, which must have once been stunning, was now a shell of its former self. Chandeliers hung precariously from the ceiling, and the marble floors were cracked and faded. But that wasn't what caught Lucas's attention. It was the portrait hanging on the far wall. His grandfather, younger, full of life, standing next to a woman he didn't recognize. And yet, that woman looked eerily familiar. Clara. His heart skipped a beat as he stared at the painting. What the hell was going on? Who was this woman really? And why had his grandfather kept this part of his life a secret from the rest of the family? The realization hit him like a cold wave. He was being kept in the dark. His grandfather had set all of this in motion for a reason, and the answers he needed weren't going to come easily. But one thing was clear. Clara Evans wasn't just some stranger. She was tied to his legacy, his family's past, in a way that no one had ever told him. And Lucas? He had no choice but to dig into the shadows of his own inheritance, whether he liked it or not. Lucas Marshall woke the next morning with a weight in his chest, heavier than he'd ever felt before. The mansion, looming outside his bedroom window like a relic of another time, seemed to whisper threats. The air was thick with the scent of decay and dust, and every creak of the wooden floorboards beneath his feet reminded him just how fragile everything around him had become, including his own composure. But the mansion wasn't his biggest problem. Clara Evans was. Every interaction with her left him feeling cornered, like he was playing a game where she held all the cards. Her defiance, her guarded demeanor, everything about her infuriated him. And the worst part? He couldn't get her out of his mind. There was something she knew, something about his grandfather and this house that he had yet to uncover. Standing in the kitchen, staring out into the overgrown garden, Lucas's mind raced. He had planned to make the best of this situation, restore the house, fulfill the ridiculous terms of the will, and leave. But now he wasn't so sure he could just walk away. Clara's presence was unsettling, not just because of her connection to his family, but because she reminded him of something, someone, he couldn't quite place. Morning, Clara's voice cut through the silence, startling him. Lucas turned sharply to find her standing in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him with that same unreadable expression. It was early, too early for her to be awake. Yet there she was, already dressed in jeans and a loose sweater, her hair tied back like she had been working for hours. He was struck by how out of place she looked in this grand, decaying mansion. For all her toughness, there was an edge of vulnerability in her, a sharp contrast to the stone-cold front she put up whenever they spoke. But this wasn't the time to try and figure her out. He had his own problems to deal with. "You're up early," Lucas said, trying to sound casual but hearing the edge in his voice. Clara shrugged, stepping into the kitchen and pouring herself a cup of coffee without asking. "This place doesn't fix itself, and I'm not the type to sit around waiting for things to happen." Her words carried a hint of challenge. "Is that why you're here?" Lucas asked, crossing his arms and leaning against the counter, his frustration mounting. "Because last time I checked, this wasn't your house." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Last time I checked, You were stuck here just like me." Her tone was light, but there was something sharp behind her eyes. Lucas clenched his fists at his sides, the tension between them rising by the second. He couldn't shake the feeling that Clara was constantly testing him, pushing him to his limits, and the worst part was, he was letting her get to him. "I'm not stuck here," Lucas snapped, stepping forward, his voice rising. "I'm here because I have to be. Once the year is up, I'm out of this place and out of your life. Don't think for a second that this is permanent." Clara didn't flinch. In fact, she almost smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Funny, I was about to say the same thing." Lucas felt his temper flare. He had never met anyone who could so easily get under his skin, who could make him feel so out of control. But before he could respond, there was a knock at the door. Sharp, urgent, and completely out of place in the quiet isolation of the mansion. Both Lucas and Clara froze, exchanging a brief glance of surprise. Who the hell could that be? The knock came again, louder this time. Lucas stormed toward the front door, his irritation spilling over. He wasn't in the mood for visitors. As he yanked the heavy door open, he was met with a familiar face. Elliot Bancroft, the family lawyer, standing stiffly on the doorstep, a briefcase in hand and a deep frown etched across his features. Lucas's stomach dropped. Whatever this was, it wasn't good. "Elliot," Lucas said, stepping back to let him in. "What are you doing here? I thought we were done with all the legal formalities." Elliot's expression remained grim as he entered the foyer, his eyes scanning the room with thinly veiled distaste. "I wish it were that simple, Lucas. But it seems there's more to your grandfather's estate than we initially thought." Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. More? How could there be more? He glanced at Clara, who was watching the exchange from the doorway, her arms still crossed but her posture tense. "Come to the study," Lucas said, gesturing for Elliot to follow him. "Let's get this over with." As the three of them sat around the old mahogany desk in the study, Elliot cleared his throat, opening his briefcase with deliberate slowness. Lucas tapped his fingers impatiently on the armrest of his chair, the weight of whatever was coming hanging over him like a dark cloud. Elliot finally pulled out a folder, placing it carefully on the desk. He opened it, revealing a stack of documents, each one marked with the familiar Marshall family crest. "There have been complications," Elliot began, his voice cautious. "It appears that your grandfather had certain assets tied to this property that we were unaware of during the initial reading of the will." Lucas frowned. "What kind of assets?" Elliot hesitated, glancing briefly at Clara before continuing. "There are financial liabilities, debts that were hidden within subsidiary companies linked to this estate. Substantial debts." Lucas's heart skipped a beat. Debts? How was that possible? His grandfather had been meticulous with the family's finances. There were never any loose ends. "How much are we talking about?" "Enough to put the estate at risk," Elliot said, his voice grave. "Unless they're settled, the house and the surrounding land could be seized by the bank." The words hit Lucas like a punch to the gut. He leaned back in his chair, trying to process the information. This wasn't just about fulfilling his grandfather's wishes anymore. This was about saving the last piece of his family's legacy. Clara, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. "How much time do we have?" Elliot looked at her, then back at Lucas. 6 months. Maybe less." Lucas closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the situation crush down on him. He had 6 months to save the estate. 6 months to figure out how to pay off debts he hadn't even known existed. And on top of that, he still had to deal with Clara. He stood abruptly, pacing the room as his mind raced. "This can't be happening," he muttered under his breath. "There's got to be another way. My grandfather wouldn't have let this happen." Elliot's expression softened, but there was no reassurance in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Lucas, but these are the facts. You'll need to find a way to settle the debts if you want to keep the property." Lucas stopped pacing, staring out the window at the overgrown garden beyond. How had everything spiraled out of control so quickly? He had come here thinking he could tough it out for a year, fulfill his obligation, and walk away. But now everything was falling apart. He turned to Clara, expecting to see some sign of victory in her expression. After all, she hadn't wanted to be here any more than he had. But instead, she looked concerned, not for him, but for the house, for whatever this place represented to her. And for the first time since they had met, Lucas saw something in her that wasn't defiance or anger. It was fear. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't just his problem. Clara was tied to this mess as much as he was. And whether he liked it or not, they were in this together. "I'll figure it out," Lucas said finally, his voice low but firm. "We'll figure it out." Clara raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "And how exactly do you plan on doing that?" Lucas didn't have an answer. Not yet. But he wasn't going to let his family's legacy slip through his fingers without a fight. He had made too many sacrifices, worked too hard to let everything fall apart now. He looked at Elliot. "Get me all the information you have on these debts. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with." Elliot nodded, gathering his papers and standing to leave. "I'll have everything sent over by the end of the day." "But Lucas," he hesitated, his gaze heavy with unspoken concerns. "Be careful. There's more at stake here than just money." Lucas didn't respond, watching as the lawyer left the room. He didn't need to be reminded of what was at stake. Everything he had ever known, his family, his legacy, his future, was hanging by a thread. Once Elliot was gone, the silence between Lucas and Clara grew thick with tension. "You think you can just fix this?" Clara asked, her voice softer than before, but still laced with doubt. Lucas met her gaze, his determination hardening. "I don't have a choice." Clara studied him for a long moment, then nodded, something shifting in her expression. "Neither do I." For the first time since they had met, Lucas felt a flicker of understanding pass between them. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that despite everything, they were on the same side. But as he turned back to the window, staring out at the decaying estate that now threatened to consume them both, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of their problems. And whatever secrets this mansion held, they weren't done revealing themselves yet. Lucas Marshall sat at the old desk in the study, staring at the mountain of papers Elliot had sent over. Each page seemed more daunting than the last, filled with legal jargon and financial figures that painted a bleak picture of the Marshall estate. The debt was far worse than he'd initially thought. Every corner of his family's legacy was entangled in bad investments, shadowed by loans that were coming due far sooner than expected. 6 months? That had been optimistic. They might have less than 3. His chest tightened as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. This was his family's legacy. His legacy, and it was crumbling in front of him. He glanced out the window, where Clara was working in the garden, pulling weeds from the overgrown beds. Even from a distance, she moved with a kind of resilience that both frustrated and fascinated him. She was always composed, always in control, and yet something told him that beneath that exterior, she was just as affected by all this as he was. The papers in front of him were just the beginning of the mess, but there had to be something more. Something that would explain why his grandfather had left things in such disarray. Why had he tied Clara to all of this? And more importantly, what had he been hiding? Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that there was a piece of the puzzle he was missing. Something buried deep within the estate, hidden beneath layers of family secrets. He rubbed his temples, his head throbbing from hours of reading. He needed a break, a moment to clear his thoughts. But as he rose from his chair, a strange noise echoed through the study, a soft, metallic clink. He froze, his eyes darting toward the sound. It had come from one of the bookshelves. He walked over, his hand grazing the spines of the old leather-bound books. For a moment, he hesitated, but then his fingers brushed against something out of place, a small, hidden latch. What the hell? With a slight tug, the latch clicked, and the bookshelf slid open to reveal a narrow, dust-filled passageway behind it. Lucas's heart skipped a beat. This was the kind of secret that only existed in stories or movies, not in real life. Not in his life. But there it was, a hidden door, right in front of him. His pulse quickened as he stepped into the passage, the air colder and mustier the further in he went. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to uncover whatever lay hidden inside. At the end of the passageway, a small room opened up. Inside was an old wooden desk, covered in dust, as though it hadn't been touched in years. Papers were scattered across the surface, and there, in the center, was a single letter addressed to Clara Evans. Lucas's stomach lurched. Why would his grandfather leave a letter for Clara, hidden away in a secret room? And more importantly, what was inside it? He picked up the envelope, his fingers trembling slightly as he tore it open. The letter inside was handwritten in his grandfather's neat, familiar script, but the words on the page were anything but comforting. As he read, his heart pounded in his chest. My dearest Clara, by the time you find this letter, you will likely have many questions. Questions about who you are and where you come from. I regret that I did not have the courage to tell you the truth myself, but the past is not always easy to face. I am your father. The words I write now are the hardest I have ever written, and I only hope that one day you will be able to forgive me for the choices I made. When you were born, your mother and I were in a difficult position. The family, the business, everything was on the line. I was weak, too weak to stand up for what was right, and I allowed the pressures of the Marshall name to dictate my decisions. Your mother was from a different world, a world the family would never accept, and so I made a terrible choice. I gave you up, let you live a life away from this family, believing it was the only way to protect you. But I never stopped watching over you, never stopped caring for you, even from afar. And now, I leave you this house, not as an inheritance, but as a chance. A chance to understand where you come from, to know that you are, and always have been, a part of this family, even if the rest of them don't know it. I leave this letter in your hands, hoping that one day you will find it and know the truth. I hope you will not hate me for what I did, though I would understand if you do. With all my love, Richard Marshall. The paper slipped from Lucas's hands as he sank into the chair behind the desk. His mind reeled, trying to process what he had just read. Clara was his aunt. His grandfather had an illegitimate daughter, and no one had ever told him. The betrayal hit him like a tidal wave, crashing over everything he thought he knew about his family. His first instinct was to storm outside, to confront Clara, to demand answers. But as the shock began to wear off, another emotion crept in: guilt. Clara had been living with this secret, a secret she probably didn't even know. She had been tied to this family without ever being allowed to claim her place in it. All this time, he had treated her like an outsider, when in reality, she was just as much a part of this legacy as he was. Lucas's hands shook as he folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. What now? How was he supposed to face her? How was he supposed to tell her that everything she thought she knew was a lie? He stood up, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. The mansion, with all its dark corners and hidden rooms, suddenly felt more like a trap than a refuge. It wasn't just the debts that threatened to tear the family apart. It was the secrets, the lies that had been buried for decades. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe. Taking a deep breath, Lucas made his way back down the passage and into the study. He could see Clara through the window, still working in the garden, completely unaware of the bomb that had just been dropped on both of them. He had to tell her. He owed her that much, at least. But as he opened the door to step outside, a figure appeared at the front gate. A tall man in a suit, his expression stern as he approached the house. Lucas frowned, his chest tightening with unease. He didn't recognize the man, but something about him set off alarm bells. Clara stood up, dusting off her hands, her eyes narrowing as the man approached. "Can I help you?" she called out, her voice edged with suspicion. The man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Evans, Mr. Marshall, I'm here on behalf of the bank. It seems we have some urgent business to discuss regarding the estate." Lucas's heart sank. Not now. Not with everything else crashing down around them. The man handed over a stack of papers, his tone cold and professional. "I'm afraid the situation is more pressing than originally anticipated. If the debts aren't settled within the next 30 days, the bank will have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings." Lucas stared at the papers in his hand, his vision blurring as the words swam before his eyes. 30 days. That was all they had left. 30 days to save everything. And now, with the revelation about Clara hanging over him, the pressure felt unbearable. Clara glanced at him, her brow furrowed with concern. What does this mean? Lucas opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain this? How could he tell her that they were about to lose everything? Not just the house, but the family legacy, the truth about her father, and everything she had been kept from her entire life. "It means we're running out of time," Lucas finally said, his voice tight. "We need to figure out a way to pay off these debts, or everything's gone." Clara's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with determination. "Then we find a way. We fight." Lucas stared at her, the weight of the letter burning in his pocket. He wanted to tell her, needed to tell her, but now wasn't the time. Not with the bank breathing down their necks and the fate of the estate hanging in the balance. But as he watched Clara turn back to the garden, her shoulders squared and her resolve unshaken, he realized something else. This was no longer just about him. For better or worse, Clara was in this just as much as he was. And whether they succeeded or failed, they were going to face it together. Lucas swallowed hard, his mind racing with the enormity of the secret he was keeping. He didn't know how or when, but the truth would come out eventually. And when it did, it would change everything. But for now, all they could do was fight. Lucas Marshall stood in the grand foyer of the mansion, the papers from the bank clutched tightly in his hands, the weight of them almost unbearable. 30 days. That was all they had. The enormity of it all crashed down on him like a tidal wave. It wasn't just the debt, the risk of losing the estate, or the family name that gnawed at him. It was the secret he was holding, the letter from his grandfather that still burned a hole in his pocket. Clara worked tirelessly outside, oblivious to the truth about her heritage, oblivious to the fact that Lucas knew who she really was, his aunt. The revelation had shaken him to his core, and yet, he couldn't bring himself to tell her. Not yet. How could he drop a bomb like that in the middle of this crisis? But every day that passed, the guilt weighed heavier on him. Every time he saw her determined face, her resolve to save the estate, he felt the burden of his silence grow. He needed to fix this. He needed to save the estate. He needed to tell Clara the truth. But there was a more immediate threat. The bank. 30 days was a blink of an eye in the world of finance, and Lucas knew the odds were stacked against them. He had already reached out to a few of his old contacts in the business world, hoping to raise enough money to cover the debts. But most of them had turned him down, politely but firmly. The Marshall name wasn't what it used to be, and with rumors of the estate's financial troubles swirling, no one wanted to take the risk. Lucas paced the study, his mind racing. He wasn't used to feeling this out of control. His entire life had been about managing situations, making the right decisions, keeping everything in order. But now, it felt like the walls were closing in on him. And no matter what he did, the ground beneath his feet was crumbling. Clara stepped into the room, wiping the sweat from her brow, her gaze sharp as it landed on Lucas. "You've been avoiding me all morning," she said, her voice low but firm. Lucas stiffened, caught off guard by her directness. She had a way of seeing right through him, peeling back the layers he tried so hard to keep in place. He wanted to push her away, to keep her at a distance, but every time he tried, he found himself pulled back into her orbit. And now, with the letter weighing on him, the tension between them had become unbearable. "I've been Dealing with the bank, Lucas muttered, his voice tight. He turned away from her, pretending to study the papers on the desk, but he could feel her eyes on him, questioning, probing. "We need to talk," Clara said, her tone softer now, but there was an edge of frustration beneath it. "About the estate, about what we're going to do. But more than that." She paused, and Lucas could hear the hesitation in her voice. "There's something you're not telling me." Lucas's heart raced. For a moment, he considered brushing her off, deflecting her questions like he always did. But he couldn't keep running from this. Not anymore. Clara deserved the truth, even if it would shatter everything between them. "Clara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I found. Something you need to know." Clara frowned, stepping closer, her brows knitting together in concern. "What is it?" Lucas took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he pulled the letter from his pocket. The room seemed to close in around him as he held it out to her, his heart pounding in his chest. "I found this in a hidden room in the mansion." Clara took the envelope, her expression unreadable as she carefully unfolded the letter. The silence stretched between them as she read, and with each passing second, the tension in the room grew heavier, suffocating. Lucas watched her closely, every nerve in his body on edge. When she finally finished reading, Clara stood frozen, her eyes still locked on the page. Her breath hitched, and Lucas could see her hands trembling slightly. She didn't look at him. For a long, agonizing moment, she said nothing. Lucas swallowed hard, his voice thick with guilt. "I didn't know how to tell you. I'm sorry." Clara's face was pale as she slowly lowered the letter. Her eyes, when she finally looked at him, were filled with a mixture of shock, hurt, and something deeper. Something that cut Lucas to the bone. "You've known about this for how long?" Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but there was a sharp edge to it, like a blade cutting through the air. Lucas's throat tightened. "A few days. I found it after Elliot came by. I was trying to figure out how to what?" Clara snapped, her voice rising, the pain in her eyes now burning with anger. "How to hide it from me? How to lie to me like the rest of your family has done my whole life?" Lucas took a step back, the force of her words hitting him like a physical blow. "No, I didn't want to lie to you. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought." "You thought what? That I couldn't handle it? That I didn't deserve to know?" Clara's voice cracked, and Lucas could see the tears welling up in her eyes. She was furious, but beneath the anger, there was a deep, profound hurt that tore at his heart. "I didn't want to hurt you," Lucas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know what to do." Clara shook her head, backing away from him, her hands trembling as she clutched the letter. "You had no right to keep this from me, Lucas. No right." Lucas's chest ached, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a vice. "I know. I should have told you sooner. But I was afraid. Afraid of what this would mean. For you. For us. For us." Clara's voice was sharp, her eyes blazing with fury. "There is no us, Lucas. There never was. You've been lying to me from the beginning." Lucas flinched, the truth of her words cutting deeper than any insult. "I haven't lied to you. Not about this. I didn't even know until..." "Until what? Until you decided it wasn't convenient for you to tell me?" Clara's voice was trembling with emotion now, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling down her cheeks. "You don't understand, Lucas. You'll never understand what it's like to be kept in the dark about your own life. To be treated like you don't matter, like you're nothing but a footnote in someone else's story." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had never seen her like this before. So raw, so vulnerable, and it tore him apart knowing that he had been the one to hurt her this way. "I do understand," Lucas said, his voice breaking. "Maybe not in the same way, but I do. I've been lied to my whole life too, Clara. About you. About this family. I'm just trying to make sense of it all, just like you are." Clara looked at him, her chest rising and falling with each shaky breath. For a moment, Lucas thought she might scream, might throw the letter in his face and walk out of the room forever. But instead, she stood there, staring at him with a pain so deep it felt like it would swallow them both whole. "I don't know what to believe anymore," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know who to trust." Lucas's heart broke at the sound of her words. He took a step toward her, his hands outstretched, desperate to fix this, to make her understand. "You can trust me," he said softly. "I know I've made mistakes, but I'm trying, Clara. I'm trying to fix this. For both of us." Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with a sadness that Lucas had never seen before. She didn't say anything for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he almost didn't hear her. "I don't know if I can." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. Lucas felt his chest tighten, the weight of everything he had done, everything he hadn't done, crashing down on him. He wanted to say something, to make her believe him, but the words wouldn't come. He stood there, frozen, watching as Clara turned and walked out of the room, the letter still clutched in her hand. Lucas collapsed into the chair behind him, his head in his hands, the crushing reality of the situation sinking in. He had lost her. He had lost the one person who understood him, the one person who could help him make sense of all of this. And now, he was alone. The next few days passed in a blur. Clara had retreated into herself, spending most of her time in the garden or walking the grounds of the estate. Lucas tried to reach out to her, but every time he did, she would shut him down with a cold, distant look. The letter had changed everything. The fragile alliance they had built was shattered, and Lucas wasn't sure how to fix it. But they didn't have time to dwell on their personal issues. The bank was closing in, and Lucas was running out of options. He had spent hours on the phone, calling in favors, reaching out to old contacts, trying to find a way to save the estate. But every conversation ended the same way, with polite refusals and empty promises. Clara had started avoiding him entirely, and it tore at him more than he cared to admit. Every day, he watched her from a distance, wondering what she was thinking, wondering if she would ever forgive him. But every time he approached, she would walk away, leaving him standing there, helpless and lost. It wasn't until the fourth day after he had shown her the letter that everything finally came to a head. Lucas had just finished another frustrating call with one of his contacts when he heard the front door slam. He rushed out of the study and into the foyer, his heart pounding in his chest. Clara stood there, her face pale and her eyes wide with shock. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Lucas's blood ran cold. "Who's here?" "The bank," Clara said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "They're here to take the house." Lucas felt like the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. No, it couldn't be happening. Not yet. They still had time. He rushed to the front door, his heart racing, and saw a black car parked at the gates, two men in suits standing beside it. They looked up as he approached, their expressions cold and businesslike. "We're here to assess the property for foreclosure proceedings," one of the men said, his voice clipped and professional. "We were told to begin the process immediately." Lucas's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not yet. "Wait," Lucas said, his voice sharp. "We still have time. 30 days. That's what we were told." The man looked at him, his expression unreadable. "The bank has decided to expedite the process due to the outstanding debts. I'm afraid there's nothing more we can do." Lucas felt the blood drain from his face. Expedite the process? How had everything spiraled so far out of control? He turned to Clara, who stood behind him, her face pale and stricken. They were out of time. They had failed. For a long moment, Lucas couldn't move, couldn't think. Everything he had fought for, everything he had tried to protect, was slipping through his fingers. The weight of it all, the debts, the lies, the secrets, pressed down on him until he could barely breathe. But then, Something inside him snapped. "No," Lucas said, his voice low but firm. "We're not done yet. You don't get to take this house." "Not yet." The man raised an eyebrow. "Sir, I'm afraid." "I said no," Lucas snapped, his voice rising. He stepped forward, his eyes blazing with a determination he hadn't felt in days. "I'll get the money. I don't care how, but I'll get it." "You're not taking this house." The man hesitated, clearly taken aback by Lucas's sudden outburst. But after a moment, he nodded. "You have 24 hours to come up with a solution. After that, we proceed." Lucas didn't wait for a response. He turned and stormed back into the house, his heart pounding in his chest. 24 hours. That was all they had left. He didn't know how he was going to do it, but he would find a way. Clara followed him into the study, her face pale but determined. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice quiet. Lucas turned to her, his jaw set, his eyes hard. "I'm going to fix this," he said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "Whatever it takes, I'm going to save this house." Clara looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. And then, slowly, she nodded. "Then let's do it together." Lucas felt something inside him shift, a flicker of hope in the midst of the chaos. He had no idea how they were going to pull this off, but for the first time in days, he didn't feel so alone. And in that moment, he realized that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The weight of the moment pressed down on Lucas Marshall as he stood in the study, the shadows of the mansion looming large around him. The 24-hour deadline hung over him like a guillotine, each tick of the clock a reminder of how little time they had left. The estate was on the verge of being seized, and despite everything, the path forward seemed impossibly narrow. He had tried every angle, reached out to everyone he could think of, but the walls were closing in. There was one last hope, but it would cost him everything. Clara stood across from him, her eyes heavy with the same exhaustion he felt. The days of tension between them, the anger and hurt from the letter, still lingered in the air like smoke. But now, standing on the edge of losing everything, the rift between them seemed insignificant compared to what was at stake. They had spent the last several hours going over every option, every potential way to keep the estate. But the truth was sinking in. This wasn't just about money. This was about what the house represented, what it meant to both of them, and the weight of the Marshall legacy. For Lucas, it had been a burden for as long as he could remember. A responsibility he never asked for, but one that was forced upon him. For Clara, it had been a painful mystery, a symbol of everything she had been denied. Now, as they faced the possibility of losing it, Lucas realized that the house was more than just bricks and mortar. It was the final connection to his family, to his grandfather, and to the truth. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words. Lucas could feel Clara's eyes on him, waiting, watching for his next move. She had every right to be angry with him for keeping the truth from her. But the look in her eyes was no longer one of betrayal. It was something else. Understanding, compassion, a shared pain. Finally, Lucas broke the silence, his voice low but steady. "There's one last thing we can try." Clara raised an eyebrow, her arms crossed over her chest. "What's that?" "I could sell my shares in Marshall Industries." Her eyes widened, a flicker of surprise passing across her face. "Sell your shares?" "That's everything, Lucas. The company, the legacy. You'd be giving up control." Lucas nodded, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. It wasn't a decision he had come to lightly. The Marshall name had always been tied to the company, his grandfather's empire. Selling his shares would mean relinquishing his power, his position, everything he had worked for. But as the days passed, he had come to realize something important. The company wasn't his legacy. This house, this family, the truth about Clara, that was the legacy that mattered now. "I know," Lucas said quietly, meeting Clara's gaze. "But it's the only way. If I sell my shares, I can raise enough to pay off the debt." We can keep the house. Clara's expression softened, and for a moment, Lucas saw a vulnerability in her that he hadn't seen before. She had always been strong, always been resilient. But now, standing on the precipice of losing the one thing that could connect her to her father, to the family she never knew, he could see how much this meant to her. You'd give all of that up for this house? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas took a deep breath. I'd give it up for what the house represents, for the chance to make things right. Not just for me, but for you. Clara's eyes searched his face, as if trying to make sense of his words. She had spent so long fighting for her place, for her identity, that Lucas knew it must be difficult for her to trust him now. But something had shifted between them, something that went beyond the letter, beyond the lies. After a long pause, Clara stepped closer, her voice soft but filled with conviction. This house isn't just your family's legacy, Lucas. It's our legacy. Both of ours. Lucas felt a lump rise in his throat. She was right. For too long, he had been clinging to the idea that the Marshall name, the company, the wealth, was his legacy. But it wasn't. It never had been. The real legacy was in the relationships they built, in the truths they uncovered, and in the choices they made to honor the past while forging a new future. I know, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. That's why I have to do this. Clara looked at him for a long moment, and then, to his surprise, she nodded. Okay, she said, her voice steady. But we do this together. The words hung in the air between them, a fragile but powerful promise. For the first time since they had been forced to share this house, Lucas felt like they were finally on the same side. They weren't just trying to save the estate. They were trying to rebuild something more important, a sense of family, a sense of belonging. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe. The next morning, Lucas made the call to his family's financial advisor. The conversation was brief and to the point. Selling his shares in Marshall Industries would raise enough money to pay off the debt and keep the estate in their hands. But it would also mean that Lucas would no longer have any control over the company. It was a bittersweet moment. A part of him mourned the loss of something he had been tied to for so long. But another part of him felt liberated, as if a weight he had carried for years was finally being lifted. When he hung up the phone, he turned to find Clara standing in the doorway, watching him. There was a quiet understanding between them now, a shared sense of purpose. It's done, Lucas said, his voice calm but resolute. We've got the money. Clara smiled, a small but genuine smile that sent a wave of warmth through him. Good, she said softly. Then we've won. Lucas wasn't sure if winning was the right word. They had saved the house, yes. But more importantly, they had saved something much deeper, something intangible. The estate would remain in the family, but the family itself was what had truly been restored. As the days passed, the tension between Lucas and Clara began to ease. They worked together on the house, repairing the broken pieces and slowly bringing it back to life. It was a long, grueling process, but each small victory felt like a step toward healing. They didn't talk much about the letter, about the revelation that had changed everything between them. But the silence between them was no longer filled with resentment. It was filled with something else. Understanding. Respect. One evening, as the sun began to set over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the estate, Lucas and Clara sat on the front steps of the mansion, watching the light fade. It had been a long day, filled with more repairs and more discussions about what the future held for both of them. But now, in the quiet of the evening, there was a sense of peace between them. Clara broke the silence, her voice quiet but thoughtful. I still don't know how to feel about all of this, she admitted. Finding out about my father, the way everything happened. It's a lot to process. Lucas nodded, understanding the weight of her words. I know. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. Clara glanced at him, her expression softening. I understand why you didn't. It's not easy to face the truth, especially when it's been hidden for so long. Lucas looked down at his hands, feeling the familiar knot of guilt twist in his chest. "I've spent so long trying to protect the family legacy," he said quietly, "but I never really understood what that meant. Not until now." Clara turned to him, her gaze steady. "What does it mean to you now?" Lucas took a deep breath, letting the words settle in his mind before he spoke. "It means choosing what kind of legacy we want to leave. Not just the money or the company, but the relationships we build, the truth we stand by, the people we choose to be." Clara smiled, and for the first time in a long time, Lucas felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had spent so many years running from the weight of his family's name, from the expectations and the pressure. But now, sitting here with Clara, he realized that the legacy he had been chasing wasn't the one that mattered. The real legacy was the one they were building together, one of honesty, of trust, and of family. A few weeks later, the final paperwork went through, and the estate was officially saved. The bank no longer posed a threat, and the debts had been settled. Lucas no longer owned a controlling stake in Marshall Industries, but he found that he didn't mind. For the first time in years, he felt free. As he stood in the foyer of the mansion, looking around at the house that had once felt like a prison, he realized how much had changed. The house was still old, still in need of repairs, but it was no longer just a symbol of his family's past. It was a symbol of the future he and Clara were creating. A future built on honesty and understanding, not secrets and lies. Clara appeared at the top of the stairs, smiling as she made her way down to join him. There was a lightness in her step, a sense of ease that hadn't been there before. "So," she said, her voice teasing, "what's next for Lucas Marshall, now that he's no longer the heir to a corporate empire?" Lucas chuckled, shaking his head. "Honestly, I don't know. But for the first time, I'm okay with that." Clara smiled, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "You've changed, you know." Lucas met her gaze, feeling the truth of her words sink in. He had changed. He wasn't the man he had been when he first walked into this house, angry, resentful, trapped by the weight of his family's legacy. He was something different now, stronger, lighter, more himself. "Maybe," Lucas said with a small smile, "or maybe I just finally figured out what really matters." Clara's smile widened, and for the first time, Lucas felt a sense of hope bloom in his chest, not just for the estate, but for everything, for the future they were building together. As they stood there, side by side, looking out at the house that had once divided them, Lucas knew one thing for certain. They had saved more than just the estate. They had saved each other. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If you loved the story as much as we did, subscribe so you don't miss any of the exciting adventures to come. We'd love to hear what you think. What surprised you the most? What do you think will happen next? Leave us a comment below and share your thoughts with this amazing community. And don't go just yet. The story isn't over. Click on the next video that's already waiting for you on the screen and keep enjoying. See you there.